You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with The Guardian's deputy political editor, Jessica Elgot, and The Times Home Affairs editor, Matt Dathan. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Well, The Guardian has an exclusive reporting that the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, has privately acknowledged the government will need to increase its pay offer to nurses. Millions more offered the chance to take statins, takes the front page of The Times, as new NHS guidelines could help millions ward off heart attacks and strokes. The Metro carries claims of sexual contact between attendees at the Downing Street parties during lockdown. Sky News has asked Number 10 for comment. The Financial Times reports the US Attorney General, Merrick Garland, has appointed a special counsel to investigate the presence of classified documents on President Joe Biden's private property. Unlike Donald Trump, Biden's lawyers returned the files promptly and are cooperating with the investigation. The Eye leads with research showing that 34 homeless children in England died over a 3-year period. The Telegraph understands the government intends to ban gas boilers in the next 10 years in an effort to achieve net zero carbon emissions. The Mirror leads with an exclusive, the headline Heroes Cancer Treatment, as firefighters at Grenfell have since been diagnosed with cancer, in some cases terminal. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Jessica Elgot and Matt Dathan. Welcome to you both. Let's start off by having a look at this exclusive from The Guardian. They're suggesting that Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, is admitting that he will have to increase the pay offer to NHS workers. That is what you probably would class as a U-turn, Jessica.
Yeah, and I think that there's actually an acceptance across government now that there will have to be a look at 2022-23, which is very, very different to what they were saying before Christmas, in the form of a one-off payment or potentially backdating the settlement that they agreed to in April to January, so they get a sort of an extra chunk of that uplift. The issue that Steve Barclay's got is that the Treasury is not giving him any new money for this. So this is something that they had to find out of existing NHS budgets, and existing NHS budgets are very, very tight. And I think that there's some scepticism across the sector about whether that is possible, whether it's the 2-3 billion, which apparently will be for them to offer around 1 million workers this improved deal. That will be quite difficult for them to get out of the existing budgets that there are for the NHS.
Yes, Matt, according to the senior sources who have spoken to The Guardian, Steve Barclay has acknowledged that more than 1 million frontline personnel deserve more money, and that's after months of him repeatedly saying that there is no more money.
Yeah, it's quite the U-turn from Steve Barclay. It was in the run-up to Christmas, the ministers would repeatedly lay out just how much it would cost if ministers were to cave into individual union demands. And you do wonder that if the government does start, compromising with nurses, are they going to start compromising with other striking workers as well? The shift really started to come at the weekend when Rishi Sunak gave an interview refusing to rule out going back to this current financial year's pay. And all through this week, there's been a slow, steady sort of expectation that the government would cave. And this story confirms it. There's a source quote right at the end of that front page story saying ministers are intent on preventing further NHS strikes, which obviously they've been trying to do throughout. But key to this is they add that they understand that there will have to be the offer of extra support on the table for 2022-23. But as Jess lays out, Jeremy Hunt is very uncompromising in saying that Steve Barclay will have to find up to £3 billion of savings elsewhere in the social care budget or the NHS budget.
And Jessica, where is the money likely to come from, do you think?
So, he can find it out of his own Department of Health budget, but very much more likely it's likely to come out of NHS England's budget. And I think NHS England has already, laid the groundwork for warnings about this and saying, if they're expecting to find £2 to £3 billion of efficiency savings. That's really for the birds, and that what it will mean is effects on frontline services. And I think when we're already seeing what pressures frontline services are under, finding that kind of money, for NHS England is going to be very difficult. And I suppose the next frontier will be is if Steve Barclay says he can't find this money, and then what happens after that? You've already heard him try to sort of lay the groundwork for this in talks with union officials on Monday, where he was repeatedly stressing things about efficiencies and trying to increase productivity in various parts of the NHS. Now, whether that's through trying to cut administration, I don't think I think there was a bit of a bad reaction to that, because essentially what people can interpret that is that NHS staff aren't working hard enough. I think more broadly what it means is trying to find places where work is being duplicated, or work there's too much administration in work, and whether that can kind of be tightened up. But whether there's £3 billion worth of that, I think is very unclear at this stage.
Matt, it does seem as though it's going to require the Health Secretary to rob Peter in order to pay Paul.
Yeah, it does. And I think with NHS bosses like Matthew Taylor consistently saying how damaging the strikes have been over Christmas, he's now going to be the centre of attention to see how he fights back, I guess, as all the other NHS bosses are. And it's just, it's very interesting that you've got Jeremy Hunt being so uncompromising in the Treasury, but you wonder how much influence actually Rishi Sunak has, given his former role as Chancellor.
To the Metro, Jessica, and we read that makeshift morgues are being opened across the UK to deal with a backlog of deaths over the winter months. There's another problem occurring as the NHS is struggling.
Yeah, and we saw those figures come out a couple of days ago that about 35,000 additional people have died, more than expected in the last 6 months, and that's, I think, about 10%, 11% more than you'd usually see over 5 years, and that's. But you have to take out of that the sort of COVID affected, the big COVID spikes that you saw in 2020. But some of those excess deaths, it's not 100% clear why that might be the case. We've seen, I think, a bit of a surge in flu and in some other viruses, but also, the thing that people will be worrying about is, are we seeing these excess deaths because, we're seeing those deaths occur mostly at home rather than in hospitals or care homes, and of course then people start to speculate whether that means that people aren't getting to hospital, they aren't getting to ambulances, maybe they're delaying treatment because they're concerned about the state of the NHS, and now of course some of the consequence of this is that morgues don't have the capacity to hold enough people who've sadly died.
Yeah. Well, the article is saying that temporary sites have been opened to cope with an estimated extra 4,000 deaths, with a combination of flu, COVID and A&E delays blamed. So A&E does seem to factor in the picture, Matt.
Yeah, that's right. And what's quite astonishing in this article is there's sort of temporary sites that councils have had to open, like a gritting yard in Salisbury in Wiltshire. In Northamptonshire, they've opened a former landfill site that's operating as a temporary morgue, which was used during the pandemic. And it just sort of reminds us of those horrific images and forecasts that we had 3 years ago at the start of the COVID pandemic. Just I guess the urgent and emergency contingency plans that councils are having to take as they see excess deaths.
Yeah, one of the areas being used, former landfill site in Wollaston, the site manager there saying that he actually wanted to remain anonymous, but saying the mortuary can hold up to 200 bodies and we will stay open as long as we're required to do so, which will probably be just another 6 weeks, he's quoting. Let's move on to the Telegraph. Hopefully an end to the rail strikes, do we think, Jessica?
There's certainly a lot more positive noises coming out of those negotiations than we've seen, definitely in recent weeks, we've had talks today between the RMT and the TSSA unions with the rail delivery group, so with operators rather than with the government. And there seems to be a new offer on the table. They've put out very kind of passive statements that say they're working jointly towards the revised offer. The discussions are continuing. That isn't the kind of fire and brimstone that we've heard from general secretaries like Mick Lynch over the past few months. So that suggests that there's a deal that they don't want to blow up, and that they're interested in. Earlier in the week, we and others reported that the government ministers were sort of prepared to quietly drop some of the things that they'd asked for, which is for these driver-only operated trains to be part of the deal and part of some of the reforms. That's something that the unions are really, really deeply opposed to. And again, that's kind of smoothed the way, I think, towards there being a deal. And I think one of the really important things about the rail deal is that whatever they decide for next year's settlement, which is part of the pay agreement, will be like a certain amount of increase over the next 2 years. We think about 9.5%. Is that it will set the bar for a lot of these other disputes. So whatever they agree with the rail unions, very likely is going to be similar to what they agree with lots of the other different industries that are going on strike.
Yeah, Downing Street hoping that the RMT will agree to a deal on Monday. There's going to be a meeting of union executives, but settling with the RMT wouldn't end all the train strikes. ASLEF still threatening industrial action, Matt.
Yeah, that's right. And ASLEF have got a mandate that's slightly longer than the RMT, I think, until June. So they could, if they wanted to strike up until then. And the ASLEF, who represent more of the train drivers, but it is very optimistic in the Telegraph, and it's not just rail disputes, but it's also a teacher dispute. The first teaching union who voted this week didn't get enough of their members voting. I think only 42% voted, and they need a threshold of 50% to vote. I think 90% of those who did vote actually backed industrial action, but it's a good development for the government. But obviously, there's, I think, at least 2 other teaching unions who are going to be voting next week. So I mean, there's some good news in after sort of weeks, if not months, of disruption across public services. But it's a question of what cost it will come, and I guess which side is going to win.
Jessica, in The Guardian, Boris Johnson is planning a trip to Ukraine to visit President Zelensky.
Yeah, so obviously we know that Boris Johnson's been a huge backer of Ukraine. He's very popular there, and I think that's obviously he's very keen to kind of keep the Ukraine on the agenda, to keep it in the news, and also I think because it's part of his reputation in government that he's quite proud of. So we know that this visit is going ahead. My colleague Pippa Crew is reporting on that, but I think there are concerns. I think some of the concerns in the piece from people quoted in the piece that it's really important that Johnson doesn't in any way undermine the relationship between Ukraine and the current and Rishi Sunak and the current number 10, and not kind of interfere with the messaging or the kind of official lines of communication. And it's Tobias Ellwood, who's the chair of the Defence Select Committee, saying that in the piece. And there's some others who are a bit more anonymous saying he's trying to have his Churchill moment, and the situation there is pretty fragile. So he really needs to be careful not to in any way compromise Rishi Sunak's relationship with Zelensky.
Ukrainian sources saying there's no concrete information yet on date. Jessica and Matt, thank you very much for the moment. We are going to take a break. Coming up, Joe Biden is accused of improperly handling classified documents. We'll explore the similarities and differences between the claims made against Donald Trump. That's coming up next. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. Still with me, Jessica Elgot and Matt Dathan. Let us have a look at the Financial Times and this story about President Biden, who's now facing an investigation. Remind us of the story, first of all, Matt.
The discovery of confidential documents and material from when Joe Biden was vice president under Barack Obama. Originally, there were documents found by his lawyers at the Penn Center in Washington, and following that, his lawyers searched his home in Wilmington and found even more documents from his time as vice president in his garage. This brought obviously comparisons with the whole Donald Trump affair, but I think there is quite a lot of differences. On the quantity of material, far less found in Biden's case, and B, also Trump's team obviously stopped the release of these documents, and Biden's team have been cooperating with them. And Biden seems in quite, he's sort of brushed it aside. He's not taking it too seriously by the sounds of it at the moment. He was joking how he keeps his car locked in the garage, so it's very secure location. But it's obviously raised some really very serious questions about protection of national security by a sitting president, and called into question whether whether he might rerun for the presidency, a decision that he's going to have to make quite soon.
Do you think that this is that serious?
Well, I think it's the FT reports that it comes at a time when his approval ratings have been quite high, and this will obviously dent the public perception of Joe Biden's. I guess it also raises question over his forgetfulness that has been sort of plagued his time as president, and the seriousness to which he takes national security. And it's coming at a quite important time when the party and he decides whether to rerun for president.
Jessica, he does seem to appeared quite flippant about it, saying, by the way, my Corvette's in a locked garage. It's not like the files are sitting out on the street. Doesn't sound very apologetic.
No, and I suspect that's a sort of tactic to play down the seriousness of it. I think it strikes me as quite ironic that that there have been these two quite serious security breaches which have actually involved physical documents, because we've heard so much over the past few years, particularly here, about people using personal email addresses or using WhatsApp groups to talk about very sensitive information. And for these two presidents, what they've actually they've come a cropper about has been storing files of paper in Trump's case in his Florida sort of compound Mar-a-Lago, and Joe Biden in his garage. So in fact, lots of it seems to be very not very much the new frontiers of tech, but actually, people just keeping souvenirs that happen to be very confidential documents.
Republicans are complaining, criticising Biden of double standards. The last story we're going to take a look at is Prince and Princess of Wales. They've been out first time since Harry's autobiography came out, Matt.
Yeah, that's right. And obviously, everyone in the country wants to know what they really think and feel in response to the damaging revelations that Harry has written about in his book. But obviously, they were not commenting on that when asked about it on a visit to the hospital in Liverpool. I think the Metro quotes one 80-year-old named Sylvia who told William that keep going, Will, Scousers love you. So sort of telling the couple that the public are very much on their side. But I guess I'll have to talk about it at some stage. I doubt they'll be talking about it anytime soon, but it'd be fascinating once they do break their silence.
Yeah, Jessica, I was going to ask that very question. Do you think we will ever hear their side of the story?
I think it's quite interesting because obviously they did initially respond to the Oprah interview. They had that very sort of famous line about recollections may vary, and William was actually sort of goaded a bit into responding to it, but with shouts across about racist family, and he says we're not a racist family. And this time there's obviously a real determination to completely ignore what was said, to not respond to those kind of shouted questions. But inevitably, at some point, one member of the royal family who's featured in this book is going to have to do an interview about something. And it's very difficult for them to completely ban any questions about this. I mean, that would be ludicrous. So, you know, if Prince William, you know, wants to, and Kate want to go on a tour somewhere, and you know, or promote one of their charities, it's quite tricky.
Yeah, we shall see if they do eventually speak. Jessica and Matt, thank you very much. See you in the next hour.